For this lab, you will need eye protection, 6 molar solutions of hydrochloric acid, nitric acid, sulfuric acid. You'll need potassium thiocyanate, ammonia, sodium hydroxide, potassium nitrite, hydrogen peroxide, and solutions of iron nitrate, copper nitrate, cobalt nitrate, silver nitrate. You'll need a test tube rack with 4 labeled test tubes, some pH paper, a centrifuge, and a hot plate with a hot water bath. Before starting, make sure you read the flow chart in the lab procedure. Plug in a hot plate and start heating a large beaker of water. Then, into test tube number 1, place about 1 milliliter of each of the solutions of silver nitrate, cobalt nitrate, copper nitrate, and iron nitrate. Use a fresh pipette for each bottle. Do not cross-contaminate the bottles. To test tube 1, add about 15 drops of 6 molar hydrochloric acid. This may fume. The fumes from HCl will sting your nose but are not particularly harmful. Check that the solution is still acidic with a strip of pH paper. Do not add the pH paper to the test tube. Use the glass rod, a droplet from the glass rod, to test on the paper on the benchtop. Red means it's acidic. Putting the paper directly into the test tube could sometimes have the color from the pH paper leach into your material. We want to avoid that. There should now be a precipitate in test tube 1. Stop at the tube and then put it in a balanced centrifuge. Close the lid. Switch the centrifuge on and spin for a minute. Allow the centrifuge to come to a complete stop before opening it. Take out test tube number 1 and decant the liquid into test tube number 2. Leaving behind the precipitate in test tube number 1. The precipitate stays in test tube number 1. The supernatant liquid is now in test tube number 2. On your flow chart, we are here. Test tube number 1 contains now only the silver. Test tube number 2 contains the other 3 metals. To test tube number 2, add 10 drops of 3% hydrogen peroxide. Then add 3 drops of 6 molar sodium hydroxide. We need to add enough sodium hydroxide that the solution is basic. Adding sodium hydroxide at this point will cause a precipitate to occur. We want to be certain that we precipitate all of the metals from the solution, so we're going to continue to add sodium hydroxide until the solution is basic. That solution is still acidic. The pH paper is showing it as red. When the solution is basic, the pH paper will be blue. There is still precipitate being formed when each drop of sodium hydroxide goes into the test tube. So we're just going to continue to add it until continued adding doesn't form any new precipitate. That solution is now basic. Stop at test tube 2, put it in a balanced centrifuge, and centrifuge for 1 to 2 minutes. Remove test tube 2 from the centrifuge. This now contains a precipitate containing the remaining 3 metals, copper, cobalt, and iron. We're going to put that in the rack and then add 6 molar sulfuric acid until the solution is acidic. We'll test the acidity of the solution with a pH strip, and when the pH strip goes red, we know that the solution is acidic. By reacidifying, the copper and iron should go back into solution, but the cobalt will remain as a precipitate. We agitated the precipitates in test tube 2 with a glass rod. The solution is acidic and it's going back into the balanced centrifuge for another minute. Remove test tube 2 from the centrifuge. You can see that the precipitate is now significantly less. This is because the precipitate is only cobalt. The copper and iron have gone back into solution. We're going to decant the supernatant liquid from test tube 2 into test tube number 3, leaving the precipitate in test tube 2 behind. So now I have test tube 2 with the precipitates, test tube 3 with the supernatant fluid. Into test tube 2, we're going to add a milliliter of 6 molar sulfuric acid. and a milliliter of 3% hydrogen peroxide. Going to shake that up. And put this test tube into the hot water bath that you prepared earlier on. Once the precipitate has dissolved, we're going to add some potassium nitrite. We're doing this inside the fume hood. It causes fumes, which is why we're performing it inside the fume hood. Ooh. When your solution goes yellow, that's a positive test. Next, add 6 molar ammonia to test tube number 3 until the solution is basic. Again, we test basicity using a glass rod and a pH paper. The solution is still acidic. Solution is not quite acidic. When it's fully acidic, basic, it will be blue. After adding ammonia, the solution in test tube 3 went dark murky green, and we're now going to cap that and centrifuge it. After 2 minutes in the centrifuge, we're going to wait for it to come to a complete stop and then take out test tube number 3. We're going to decant the supernatant solution from test tube number 3 into test tube number 4, leaving the precipitate behind. The presence of a blue color in test tube number 4 is evidence that there is copper in test tube number 4. For test tube number 3, we're going to add 6 molar sulfuric acid. We're going to add 6 molar sulfuric acid to this precipitate until it dissolves. Adding sulfuric acid to test tube 3 made the precipitate dissolve. Now we're going to add potassium thiocyanate into test tube number 3, and if it turns red, that will be a positive test for iron. checking with the flow chart, we can now see that the 4 metals that were in the initial mixture, silver is in test tube 1, cobalt is in test tube 2, iron is in test tube 3, and copper is in test tube 4. We have successfully separated the metals from each other. Waste from this lab goes into the inorganic waste bottle in hood number 7 in the chemistry stockroom.